So, Adia, thank you. And I'll give just a little bit of background. So I'm based in Boston, as Dia said, and focus primarily on therapeutic companies at relatively early stages. And I'll give my brief experience, what I've seen or witnessed as an investor, and then we can jump right in, given that I'm excited to hear from this terrific panel we have of entrepreneurs that have actually done this. We've been investing in both India and China healthcare companies alongside our sister fund, Eight Roads, since the mid-2000s, and maybe even a little earlier than that. And two observations. One, China has rapidly moved up the innovation curve since the early 2010s, maybe mid-2010s. Without a doubt, India still dominates in terms of scale of pharmaceuticals, and that's primarily seen in the US, EU generic space, including the India generic space and APIs. But China has now built multiple large molecule, NCE, and even cell therapy companies in the past 5-10 years. And just to give everybody a little bit of context, there's a company called Legend Biotech. It's a listed pharmaceutical company in China now, which is developing a cell therapy CAR T, which will likely become the most successful cell therapy to date. So this is a partnership with J&J where it was all in-house developed in China. For India pre-COVID, and I think Prem mentioned this earlier, we would see about maybe 1 or 2 prospective deals in the biotech space per year, maybe slightly more than that. Over the past 3 or 4 years, that pace has increased significantly, and now we're probably seeing that many in a month, if not even more. And the quality of the assets and the innovation we're seeing and the teams that are developing these drugs or discovering the drugs is improving as well. So with that background, let me start off with Anil. And I'd say if you're looking back at Spark, which today has 2 to 3 commercial stage assets, albeit initially lower stage, followed by 3 to 4 NCEs in their pipeline. What would you say has worked well historically for you? What didn't work well, and what would you do differently in terms of building a world-class biotech discovery business today, whether it's in India, in the US, or cross-border?
Thank you, Ketan, for the opportunity. I hope you can hear me well. Let me start off with a little bit of correction. I'm not a PhD scientist or a physician, even though I got introduced as a doctor. I'm an industrial engineer who kind of sleepwalked into life sciences 20 years plus back now. So Spark, as you know, we got incubated within a large specialty generic system, Sun Pharma. And the initial focus was somewhat, slightly different from similar efforts from other large Indian pharmaceutical companies who were launching innovation businesses at that time. I mean, we had a focus on lower risk, 505(b)(2) delivery system innovation kind of opportunities. And I guess looking back, it worked well in the sense, we have invested around $500 million plus in the Spark effort so far. Now, almost 60% of that is essentially internal revenue created from these initial efforts on delivery system innovation. So that gave us sustainability compared to some of the early efforts in the space in India. So I think that's definitely some of the things that we worked. And we also, by 2014, 2015, when the reimbursement environment around delivery system innovation began to become more toxic, we kind of pivoted away from focusing on delivery system innovation. And I think that was the right call if I look at it now. What we could have done differently, I think we had assets which could have prioritized differently. So if you look at our own experiments with, say, S1P1 receptor as a class, for example, we had an asset in 2014. At that point, we looked at the competitive space very differently from somebody like Arena look at that opportunity, right? So if we had prioritized certain assets differently, I think we had bigger success with some of the NCA efforts. So I think our ability to take commercial decisions, prioritization decisions, was not sophisticated enough at that point to understand the potential of these opportunities, and that's something which we could look differently.
Very good. And we'll come back and talk about that class specifically with Sheila in a little bit as well. Maybe sticking a little bit with this cross-border theme, which has somewhat been common over the past 20 years with some other geographies. And what I mean is the U.S. has a long history of in-licensing assets from Japanese pharmaceutical companies and from Japanese startups. But it has not been as common with India. So maybe with that background, it'd be great to hear from you, Claire, about your experience with effectively in-licensing or out-licensing, depending on how you look at it, IP to a Boston-based startup. And maybe you can start a little bit with the technology and IP considerations, and then it'd be great to hear about your experience with Bicara Therapeutics.
Sounds great. So Bicara's history is that the initial IP in the molecule was developed in-house within Biocon's novel drug discovery unit. There had been a team of scientists working on what became a novel bifunctional antibody for oncology. And I think the real rationale for moving it out of Biocon initially was really this wasn't in strategy for a company like Biocon, which is predominantly within the biosimilars and the generics and API space, and really building a team around it that would have the clinical development expertise to bring it into global development. And we really at the time believed that clinical development expertise needed to happen in the US. So, from an IP standpoint, I think there are the ease of IP transfer was probably the simplest of them all in terms of what was developed in India versus, what we were able to bring in. But I think, the real rationale here was finding the right team who could champion that for US development, given that's typically the largest market, and then can grow globally from there. I think the second piece that was really important, just from a bridging that gap of something that was developed in India and beyond, is really building a credible team of strong immunologists and cancer biologists in India. I think our strength really came from an expertise in CMC and biologics development that we were able to leverage and probably do so much more rapidly in India to develop the molecule than we would have been able to do in the US alone. But investing in early research, discovery research, I think, has been what's taken the most time. The team today in India, which remains based in India, is really an expert team. But typically, what you see is scientists trained either in the U.S. and Europe with PhDs or postdocs tend to remain in Europe and the US. And so finding that right core team that can grow and build a discovery effort, took us 4 or 5 years to really continue to build.
Anil, maybe going back to Spark as well, what were, can you comment on some of the unique human capital and talent needs at the startup phase and how that may have been different as you sort of moved forward into the clinic?
I think in the case of Spark's initial effort, I think we were building on a roster of competencies that we've transitioned from a specialty generic setup. So our abilities in, say, asset creation, like, say, for example, medicinal chemistry, which is most of our focus early on, small molecules, that was there to a certain extent. And delivery systems, as in formulation sciences and other pieces of preclinical translational development, were there in terms of pharmacology, our ability to IND enable a program. Where we struggled was early stage biology, understanding of pathways, designing the right experimental systems, and also creating an ecosystem of competence, because we don't have all the required pieces of the tool set here in India, right? Whether it is crystallography, access to chemical space, a lot of competencies are just not accessible locally here. So creating those ecosystem connections globally and looking at this effort as a global effort, not just an Indian effort where we're trying to do everything from India, was actually a difficult mindset shift. And those are some of the competencies that we kind of lacked early on the discovery stage. But as the programs move forward, that is changing. I think our own maturity in early stage biology and understanding, at least in the therapeutic areas that we are active, whether it is oncology or neurodegenerative diseases, I think we managed to bridge some of those gaps with investments both in India, people coming back from other geographies back to India and helping to plug that expertise gap, and also making the right connections with collaborators globally. But now the challenge has shifted more towards translational development and clinical execution, whether it is biomarkers, our ability to execute a clinical program well, design a clinical program well. So the kind of challenges that we face now are very different from what we've initially started out with.
And what was the to be a fly on the wall, but how did the discussion go when either you brought back or the board said, we're going to put up a shingle in just outside Princeton, and have ultimately a very large group of U.S. employees bi-coastally? How did that decision work out for you?
Yeah, as the programs moved into clinical development, we did not have an option but to build something here in the US, because one of the decisions that we've taken is our primary theater for development is the US, because we want to develop products for the largest commercial market. So in that sense, being there, done that experience in clinically developing programs is important, and we just don't have that experience in India or expertise in India. Plus the regulatory scientists, interface with the FDA, expertise in stats, all of those pieces, we just don't have, we just didn't have an option of trying to build that in India. And so it was a logical call to have something in the US, and East Coast helped because our parent company had an infrastructure there, and we could kind of ride on that. So it was just a little, efficient to do that. But the choice of, having something in the U.S. as a kernel of clinical capability was not really a choice. We had to do it.
Fair enough. So Sheila, I'll turn to you, and maybe we can shift gears a little bit here. And I'll ask you as a serial entrepreneur who has both large pharma at MNCs and small pharma experience across therapeutic areas, what does it take, and what are the elements needed to build a high-quality ecosystem that could be self-sustaining for biotech?
Well, thanks, Ketan. It's a great question, and one I've been thinking about for many years, because I live in San Diego, which is probably the smallest hub. Now there's obviously areas in the Mid-Atlantic, Texas, other, the Midwest that are emerging in the United States, but the Bay Area, where I spent a number of years at Genentech, and then of course in the Boston, Cambridge area now, are obviously very strong. And then there's a large pharma corridor in the New Jersey, New York area. So much talent there. So, it's interesting thing about the ecosystem. I think, I like to think about companies as well as the ecosystem in terms of like a three-legged stool. Like, what are the different aspects? And of course, that's my McKinsey background too, right? Rule of threes. Obviously, it's much more complicated than that. But I think one thing is you do need the talent. It's just incredibly important. The people drive businesses. They're the ones that make the programs. They create these companies. They sustain them. They develop these therapeutics, delivery systems, whatever you're working on. So I really appreciate Claire and Anil's comments on the importance of the talent, of building the talent, how long it's taken to find the right people. I can comment on the San Diego area. It's been predominantly more of a research area for many of the larger pharmaceutical companies. They have a research site in San Diego, so they have terrific scientists, chemists, some biologists, CMC folks, but they were really lacking on clinical development and translational and commercial expertise, similar to, I think, in India when you are making those important transitions around therapeutics. So when I joined Receptos in 2011, I was the first clinical hire. There really wasn't as much development talent here in the area, so really had to build that and bring in people from other parts of the country, pulling on my BMS roots where I was running immunology, where, obviously Genentech in the Bay Area and other, really my network and obviously a bigger network. That's definitely changed now. I think, we obviously have a number of very important companies here in the area and a lot of great exits, including Receptos and others, a Turning Point, Arena, you mentioned Prometheus. Lots in the GI space that were really spearheaded by Receptos, frankly. But again, that's the talent. Then people can kind of keep paying it forward and keep then develop new companies. The second is really so there's the talent, and not only the talent, it's the leadership. It's having really credible industry leaders, people who've done it before, people who understand how to develop companies, build companies, so that's critically important. The next are investors. You do need, I think, especially in biotech, it's a very different beast than generics. So you need to find strategic investors who understand the business of biotech, which is a huge cost expenditure for many years until you see a return. High risk, high reward, very different mindset. And I also mention this because I have now worked with several Indian biotech companies, trying to fund them, trying to really bring their, help build their companies and get the right investors in the mix. But I think that's important. Clearly, most of the, healthcare VCs and hedge funds are in the major, financial markets in the U.S. So we actually don't have that many in San Diego itself, but we have a number of VCs who've repeatedly invested in San Diego biotech companies and who have a great network, including OrbiMed and Arch and lots of, Foresight, really big, large companies. Really now most of the VCs have done investments in the San Diego and Southern California area. And then, last but not least, really is a very strong academic community. So, we have a number of very important academic institutions and scientific founders coming from those institutions who are serial entrepreneurs and have created multiple companies working with a number of important venture and groups and other investment groups. And I think that's a critically important because obviously we capitalize on understanding about validated targets and going after those and differentiating. And I think India can do that well with so many of the CROs that are there and the talent that's existing. But novel discoveries, novel chemistry platforms, novel ways of engineering biologics and protein engineering, RNA therapeutics, cell therapy, in the Southern California, LA, Westlake Village area, really critically important to have that type of academic expertise and funnel and partnership with industry, academics, and investors. That collaboration, I think, is incredibly important for a sustainable ecosystem. And then, and I should have mentioned, and having successes. Once you have one success or multiple successes, in an area. When I came here in 2011, it was not, we were definitely not in a great place. The financial markets were shut down for many years. Very difficult time for private financing. Thank God the IPO market opened up, and we were one of the first ones to go out at Receptos in 2013. Changed the whole business, and then again, a number of companies went out after that. But once you start having those successes, fueled by these different groups who are working in close collaboration, that really also makes a big difference in establishing an ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, I think back to Boston. I'm not sure that ecosystem would have been the same if there was no Biogen, if there was no Genzyme that allowed, super successes publicly. Ultimately, were, at least one of them was acquired, but allowed for the talent pool to exist. Along those lines, and I'll throw this question out to maybe all three of you, but I've heard so far, that talent pool is a critical piece that's still in its infancy, at least on the India side of innovative biotech. Since the late, call it 2000s, around 2008 program, we've seen a lot that has changed with China's 1,000 Talents program initiative, and this was primarily done by the Chinese government to recruit science and technology experts, often from overseas Chinese communities, including the U.S., many countries in Europe, back to China with significant levels of funding. And so if you're an academic and you're developing something and someone tells you they will give you more money and fund your lab, you can fight tooth and nail to get grants from NIH, or you can get it very quickly from Chinese sources of funding and government funding. Now this program has become controversial with the political landscape changing, but has been arguably successful in fostering a biotech ecosystem in China. And so I don't have a regulatory background, but after that first panel today, I will in any case invoke it, and I'll ask the panel, what are your thoughts on having a program like this that is backed, at least on the dollar side, by the government in India, maybe in a couple of hubs, Mumbai, Bangalore?
So another example I think that has been really successful is the Singapore STAR program, where they fund PhDs at the top schools. In fact, while I was at Stanford doing my PhD, other than U.S. citizens or green card holders who could get NIH funding because it was a translational PhD, the only internationals were mostly Singaporean students who then would go back to Singapore and be able to establish their labs. And I thought that for many of them, that was a very successful program. They were able to bring really incredible talent back to Singapore. So, I do think there is an investment needed to be made at many of these universities, whether it's through philanthropy or, through a national Indian regulatory piece. I think the nuances of that I don't understand as well either. But if we can create these hubs, I think the IISCs of India have the resources, and we could really build something there. That to me is the missing point. We have expertise in biologics and small molecules when it comes to manufacturing, but it's really the early discovery that I think India could easily be on the map for.
No, I think it is highly, there is absolutely no debate on whether it is desirable or whether it's the right thing. I mean, I think we got to find a way to get talent back, especially scientific talent with unique insights into diseases. That's something that we clearly miss also. But that alone is not going to be sufficient in my opinion, because if you look at other inefficiencies in the system, whether it is access to resources, access to reagents, chemical space, we are dependent on accessing those resources globally, and in many cases in competitive development situations, that cannot sustain. We cannot build winning programs if we need to wait for months to get access to a cell line or access to reagents, which is possible in US or in China in days, right? So I think there has to be public investments in creating a resource backbone, which early stage companies can more readily access. Is probably as important as getting talent back. And we often discuss, the priority around that is probably not as high as the talent question.
Yeah, I would agree with Anil and Anil's comments there. I think I also agree, like, absolutely should be done in the sense that, strengthening that, the ecosystem, the research aspect, academics, pouring money in investments, improving access, all fundamental building blocks. So definitely, I think that would be tremendous. I think there has been success in China. I think there could be success in India. Obviously, you'll have to see how that fares, with initial successes. And I think if the initial individuals who go through that program and are successful, I think that will draw more individuals who will be interested in coming back to India and establishing themselves there and really driving, their careers in India, which would be amazing. I'm involved with running a group of, Indian successful biotech executives in the U.S. It's incredible how successful Indian Americans have been in the United States in the biotech pharma industry. When we look at the list of people we're bringing together, it's the who's who, not only, obviously operators, biotech executives, investors, bankers, just, pharma executives, just really incredible. And obviously investors, so many investors who are Indian. From my perspective, when you look at creating a multinational, global, successful biotech company, even as an emerging biotech, and I have been, again, working on this, I think investors want to see several things. One is IP. They want to see IP in the United States. So, whether IP is coming in India, I think, really having IP in the US, clear plans on development, as Anil and Claire have mentioned, really understanding the discovery development plans and having that clear view and working with people in the United States, because it's going to be difficult to replicate all of that, especially in different disease areas. And then the ability to drive the clinical data. And China has done that incredibly well. I think those mechanisms are going to maybe challenge in terms of their IIT process, where they've been able to really generate clinical data very quickly. But that's been incredibly compelling. But now when I see China investments, I'm seeing them come to the US much quicker and doing their clinical trials in the US even earlier, just so they have data in the US, because, they have the credibility around the IP, the discovery science, and then obviously the clinical data. So those collaborations into, the US and European, regulatory as well as clinical trial sites, I think is imperative. But there can be a lot of great clinical work that's done in India as well, with the right expertise, right leadership, right investigators, that site development, investigator development, working with the Indian health authorities, I think can be a great competitive advantage also.
And maybe staying, Sheila, on that point, what do you think? Look, if I would love to have a 1,000 talents program out of Mumbai and Bangalore. I think that would clearly change the talent pool. But what do you believe that the Indian pharmaceutical regulators could do to further foster innovation in India and maybe bring some of that speed you talked about? We've seen the green channel in China. We've even seen the US try to make some regulatory changes to speed up development. And Claire, maybe you can touch on that as well. But maybe starting off with Sheila, what do you think could be done from a regulatory perspective in India to foster innovation?
Yeah, I think that's critical. I think having some changes in that, working with the regulatory health authorities there. From my perspective, it's relationships. It's the same thing what we do here in the FDA or with the EMA or the scientific health authorities in Europe, country specific. It's a lot of discussion, relationships, partnerships, working with, again, industry experts, as well as academic leaders, coming together to work with the health authorities to explain what the science is, what the vision is for the development plan, always ensuring patient safety first and foremost, which has been a lot of the focus, which I completely agree with. But really driving towards innovative development. I think, even with the FDA, I always say, they're not incentivized to take a risk. It's really their job is to safeguard, patient safety. But then you can get incredibly risk averse and make development very challenging. And I've worked across multiple divisions and therapeutic areas within the FDA, and they're very different, as you can imagine. But I think, when you have the right relationships, you spend the time with the health authorities, you let them know what you're doing, you provide the data, you work with them. I think it's amazing what you can get done in that collaboration and partnership. But you need to have that vision, you need to put together the rationale, and you need to, really put together strong data packages to make those convincing arguments. And so when and I think you need to have that at several layers within the health authorities. You obviously have to have the most senior levels, and that's where you may need government, senior industry leaders in India. You have great pharmaceutical companies there who have done incredible amount of work on the generic side, but also, on branded generics who've come in with innovative mechanisms. I was part of that when I was running immunology at BMS when we got Orencia approved in India. That's what it took. So this is all possible. So you can have a coordinated effort at the most senior levels, but then individually for each company, that this also can be done. I'm seeing it being done today. So and then I think as more of it gets done, you'll see a shift in that partnership, and then the innovative aspects, and hopefully they'll embrace programs where they will be really encouraging Indian biotech companies to come to them for innovative products.
And Claire, maybe what would the regulator have to do differently for you to develop what is arguably the most active head and neck cancer drug we've ever seen in India? I mean, head and neck cancer accounts for 30% of all new tumors in India. What has to be done differently? What makes you decide finally that you're going to go to your board and say, I'm going to develop it in India?
I think for us, the ecosystem around the hospitals and the biomarkers and the translational piece, I think was the missing piece, really on a development side. There you can do some early proof of concept in India at different hospitals. I think, Tata Memorial Hospital in Bombay is a great example of a hospital that likely has the resources to do this. But the ecosystem just isn't the same as in the US. You have, here we can quickly leverage CROs and get to 20 different academic centers who can do repeat biopsies for us, do analysis that is really going to prove out the thesis that we have an active drug. If that same infrastructure existed in India, I think it would be a no-brainer. Of course, India is probably the largest head and neck cancer, unfortunately, center in the globe, and there's a lot that we could do and test. But at the time, the key piece for us to really prove out investments, or to get investments and be able to raise that kind of capital, the early science and translational work was far more believable in the US. And so I think that to us was the missing piece, is that just there isn't an ecosystem and infrastructure around the different hospital systems to really build this out. We need to do repeat blood draws and that need to be analyzed by central labs and the like. We need scans on every 6-week basis. And also, I think the key difference in some cases is also just the frontline therapy market is very different in the US and Europe than it is in India. Most patients in head and neck don't have access to pembrolizumab, the anti-PD-1, and so it's a different development strategy. That's not to say that we can't do different proof of concepts in India, but we didn't feel that infrastructure was there for us to begin there.
And
I
Anil,
can comment on that.
yeah,
I
go
can
go ahead,
comment on
Sheila.
that. Yeah, I think that's right. Claire brings, she's absolutely right. Like the hospitals, the investigators, really experienced investigators is so critical for all of our clinical trials, whether it's early or, more mature trials like phase 2, 3. And I have done development in India for large multi-country, global studies, especially in the non-oncology areas. And there's a way to go after, like, with the patient eligibility criteria, trying to get to that, more like patients, more homogeneity in terms of the disease characteristics and the assessments that you're doing that are objective. But I have to say, outside of oncology, most of the patient enrollment comes from Eastern Europe and other demographic areas that do not come from the US. Or Western Europe. For most of the autoimmune disease studies that I've been involved with, we rely on certain countries to drive enrollment, and that has been for India in certain circumstances and certain disease areas. But and there are obviously CROs that are working in India, but that's a big area of opportunity. If you can, CROs, and again, the right levels of the investigators and industry professionals are working together. That's a huge market there. And there's diabetes. I mean, there's so many different therapeutic areas that, we could do a lot more work in. And I think, but it takes time. You have to train those investigators. You have to, really do a lot of auditing, again, you have to build that ecosystem around that. But once you do, that draws a lot of investment.
Yeah. And Anil, I think I'll ask you the same question, but take off your Spark hat and put on your former Quintiles hat. I mean, almost all the growth in the CRO space 15, 20 years ago came from India, and that was very significant. What needs to happen to keep that momentum going? One, and once again, what do the regulators need to do to, as Sheila and Claire have said, we're not quite there yet for either one of them to want to do their studies right now. What needs to change?
I think we had a very difficult phase in between in the early part of last decade, like 2010 to 2013, where attitude towards research in India has been toxic. And I have to give credit to the regulators. In the last 8-10 years, I think there is a significant shift in terms of the policy orientation and the support for research in India. And both in terms of the process efficiencies of getting a trial started here in India and the quality of reviews that we get. I mean, there is a lot to improve in that area, but we are seeing a remarkable shift in the last 7-8 years in terms of how the regulatory process works. I mean, I echo some of the comments Claire and Sheila made in terms of the quality of research infrastructure, in terms of the sophistication of size investigators, size staff. I think we have a thin sliver of capability in larger hospital systems, but to truly tap into the potential of the patient pool in India, we got to broad base this substantially, and that requires investments in research infrastructure in India, especially in tier 2 and tier 3 cities, where there is substantial access to patient possible, but just don't have the capability to conduct a global protocol or a sophisticated protocol. So I think that's a gap that it can only be bridged with a substantial public-private participation, not just a regulatory law. So I don't think from a clinical trial standpoint, a regulator is not the issue at the moment. It was, but it is not the issue anymore. But there are other areas like where regulatory process can be improved. Processes around large animal research in India is a significant possible area of improvement because we're dependent on limited capacity in China and certain European countries to conduct these trials. And that more than money, it creates significant lag in the program. So if there is ways to improve certain other aspects of research. I think there are a lot of places where regulatory change is possible, but fortunately, we've made progress in clinical trials.
Neil, what are your thoughts on India for India in the drug discovery space? And we've seen a lot of that in China. And in fact, China has more PD-1s than the U.S. does. They're successful, well-proven drugs. Especially given Prime Minister Modi's push for innovation, funding grants, incubators that are either here or coming, are you sensing change today? And how could you potentially tap into a India for India opportunity?
I would broad base. I think it's not just for India, from India for India, but also for emerging markets. I think emerging markets is a significant driver of global growth for the industry. And there can be alternative propositions from a cost standpoint that can be built from India. So our own domestic market, unfortunately, not at a place in terms of value to support original development. And unless we see this opportunity differently by including other parts of the emerging market, which I think is quite possible, we still, we won't be able to make progress, in my opinion.
Fair enough. Just we've got about 2 minutes, and I'll take a couple questions, but one last question, maybe a rapid fire for all three. Sheila, you spoke a lot about risk capital. Very quickly, do you think it's possible to build a NASDAQ-like risk capital market in India?
I don't think we're there yet, obviously. I think what I was looking for more was just, getting the right, just more investors, who are like you, this great conference, you guys are doing some terrific work in funding innovative companies, moving beyond generics and the biosimilar spaces. And I think just kind of really building out that investor ecosystem. If you get those individuals in, the public markets will come. The crossovers, the public markets. In the sense that, I think people will see those opportunities. But I think, to me, that's where I would focus first.
Yeah. Claire, and maybe Claire and Neil, one little spin to that question is, what can maybe it's not at the Genzyme or Biogen level yet, but what can Sun, Biocon, some of the large established companies do to potentially create a risk capital environment in India for biotech or startup biotechs?
Yeah, I think even the Biocons of yesteryear had a lot of trouble finding that early stage investment. We at Bicara went out to Indian investors as well. And in general, even the ones that were invested in healthcare said, we invest in large hospital systems or generics. Early discovery, novel drug discovery just wasn't in strategy. And I think it goes back to, some of the early points Sheila made at the beginning, where we haven't had that many successes. Biocon is trying to establish itself, within the biosimilar space, which I think is, slightly different than the original generics and enzymes business, of course, that initiated it. But it still needs to really become a truly global successful player for that type of large investments, from the large private equity firms or hedge funds to come in. And I don't think the Indian Stock Exchange is really necessarily the place that has worked. I think if we take the example of Indian tech, whether it be the Infosys and Wipros, some of those examples of also listing in the US have probably been the right approach to putting these players really on the global map. And so maybe that's the approach, is for these Suns and Biocons and Dr. Reddy's to really establish themselves as far more global players before that capital will come in.
Fair enough. Yeah, are we out of time for questions? Maybe, so maybe we could take one question, yeah?
This is Neil from Meta Partners. We do work with a lot of biotechs, even in India, doing some cutting edge work. And the only disadvantage that they have is they are based out of India. It is just geographical disadvantage. Is the only near-term option for them to front end in the US, or are there any suggestions that you may have which can also lead to their evolution, maybe at par with what a biotech in the US would experience? And I think at the end of the day, it is catch-22. In India, investors need to see one Genzyme before they can have confidence in the biotech space. They haven't seen that yet. So just wanted to get your perspective on that. A company which is not backed by a Biocon or a Sun in this case, doing work which is cutting edge, what would be your feedback in terms of them evolving in a particular direction? Thank you.
I think even, as a company backed initially by Biocon, we faced a lot of significant headwinds in trying to bring in US-based investors at the beginning. It didn't help that the field we were in the TGF-beta space had gone down just in general based off of some larger pharma companies. But I think there's this proof point that comes when you're able to either prove it clinically or preclinically that the science works, and getting to that point doesn't necessarily have to be backed by a Sun and Biocon, but being able to find the right resources in India to get to that important proof point, and then be able to raise the resources globally. Unfortunately, I think today, because it goes back to we don't have the success stories yet, we are going to face those biases in the US and Europe and globally. But I do think being able to really prove out your thesis is what's going to help us, some of these much smaller biotech companies. And it goes back to, the original point. We need more 8 roads and F primes to really invest in early stage biotech and build that ecosystem of investors who have an appetite for risk and understand that biotech investment, takes hundreds upon hundreds of millions before you're really going to see a significant payout.
Very good.
I would say, just know it's tough everywhere. I mean, it's especially right now. I mean, I can tell you how challenging it is in the US as well for any starting biotech or innovative small biotech company that's in the process of trying to generate that compelling value inflection data. So just please know that. I mean, in this particular time frame. Having said that, I agree with Claire. I mean, it's really around the credible science, doing the right experiments and generating that great data. And there will be biases. So kind of reaching out and getting input. And I will tell you, there are a lot of investors who will take meetings. They'll want to understand your story. They'll want to understand your presentation, your pitch, and they will give you feedback. You have 8 roads, and F prime. So and Kate Dunn, who's amazing, in terms of individuals who can give you some very good advice, and I would then take that advice to heart. I also see that, I don't see the follow through. You'll figure out what that path needs to be, and then hopefully you can get some resources to be able to do those types of important studies. And really, it just takes some key pieces of data, very important, rationale, and then working with even U.S. academics or European academics on your story, getting them involved, maybe doing some collaborations with them and having them also help you tell your story, or even thought leaders, on the industry side in these different markets, I think could be really great for you to bring in and bring that type of talent in and help you, do your presentations and talk to investors. I highly recommend that as well.
Excellent. I think I'm getting ushered off. So, with that, let me thank our panel. I know it's early, and Sheila, I know it's super early on the West Coast. So, thank you.
Like I'm jet lagged already.
Thank you for taking the time.